Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and the working title for today's show is Utility Scale Battery Storage in Ontario Takes a Huge Step Forward as Oneida Comes Online. My guest is Matt Jamieson, the President and CEO of the Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation, one of the joint venture partners that built the Oneida project. So, welcome to the Energy Show, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Well, in a way, I'm having you back because I think we spoke about this 4 or 5 years ago. The United Project goes back to 2018. You were still in the development stage when I talked to you. Now you brought the project online. So maybe tell us a little bit, give us my viewers a little bit of a background of what it is and how long the steps to get it to bring it to market.
Yeah, well, it certainly has been a journey, I can tell you that. As you mentioned, Markham, we started this way back in 2018 as an idea. Six Nations Development Corporation has been a fairly large investor in the renewable energy space for a number of years. We have just over 2 gigawatts of energy generation assets in our portfolio. We saw firsthand as an asset owner the intermittent nature of renewables. We also heard from, stakeholders in the region about their feelings about renewables when their hydro rates were going up and they're looking at wind turbines in their backyard. They weren't necessarily happy. We knew though that there's tremendous value in harnessing the gifts of our creator through wind and solar, and we felt it was time for us to propose a solution, which was to build a tool in the energy market that could harness this great value and utilize it in its optimal conditions. And so back in 2018, we came up with this concept. Let's build a large grid connected energy storage project, the first of its kind really in the country. And it took us a long time to convince, the province of Ontario, the IESO,
Uh,
and others in terms of the viability and the order of magnitude that we were talking, and what the outputs and value would be to ratepayers generally, but also to the environmental and from an environmental perspective as well. So it's been a journey, but one that's been tremendously rewarding, as you've noted. We just announced the COD of the operation in the last couple of weeks.
Matt, you mentioned the independent electric system operator in Ontario, and I've interviewed the Alberta AESO grid manager, and we've done stories about power grids in other provinces, and many of them stories about what's going on in the United States. So I'm very curious about the tone and nature of your conversation with the system operator in Ontario. It sounds like they were skeptical at first, and it was what changed their mind?
Well, I think that, in the order of magnitude we're talking about tonight, so it's a 250 megawatt facility, 1,000 megawatt hours, so a 4 hour runtime. And the order of magnitude in and of itself was big. We're talking about a $700 million project. And of course, leaning on the province for, a contract to help make the economics work. And you know what? I think everyone in Ontario can reflect back on the old feed-in tariff days, which provided healthy economic returns to investors, which we were a benefactor of, quite frankly. But as the new government came in Ontario, they wanted to be, I think, more cautious around how they contract these types of services. And so there was a learning curve involved for the province of Ontario and the IESO in particular to get comfortable around what that contract needs to look like. The challenges we faced during that same time, though, Markham, if you can think back, this is COVID days. This is, lithium pricing was up 400%. Commodity pricing was all over the map. Foreign exchange was up, very, very volatile. So there was a lot of moving parts in the market at the time. And so, the IESO, I think to their credit, really wanted to do a deep dive in the project economics and make sure that they didn't enter into a contract with the Oneida project that was too lucrative. But at the same time, there was also a learning curve with respect to, the attributes of this asset and how it can serve the needs of the energy market in Ontario. So, I certainly was a learning curve, but I think that ultimately they got where they needed to go on the contracting side, and we were able to conclude a contract.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the services that the storage system provides to the grid in just a moment. But you have been working on this project over the last 7 years, during which we've seen enormous cost decreases in both on the generation side, wind and solar, and on the battery side, which I mean the cost curve has just fallen off a cliff. So, did you notice, did the project economics improve over time as you develop the project? Did the business case get better?
Well, it did. It did get better, but I mean, partly that's because of, the reduction in lithium pricing, right? Because I mentioned that lithium pricing was up 400% at the time when we were trying to finalize contract negotiations with the IESO. So everybody was nervous. We were nervous. And there were many times, Markham, where Enerstore, our partner, and I, who were the early 50/50 developers of the project, we thought that this might not fly given the volatility in the market. But, as we've seen, Oneida now come online, we've seen Ontario enter into an expedited and then an LT1 and now an LT2 procurement initiatives here in the province. You see more competitive pricing in the market. These are, the economics are running more to ground, and we're able to better predict, the viability of competitive pricing in the market. So, it's been a journey, and you know what? I'd like to say that, Six Nations and our partnership with Enerstore, we were, the energy storage maker, and we were a price maker at that time, and now it's evolved into, price takers, and through a competitive procurement environment, which I think is the right thing to do. But of course, the challenge is, there's many developers out there who want to break into the storage space because it is critically important for the future of our energy grid in Ontario. It's just to make sure that the project economics are well thought out and you don't get yourself in a situation where you overpromise and underdeliver on project execution.
Your press release had a line in there that really interested me, which is you have a 20-year offtake agreement with the system operator, and you mentioned that that functioned almost like a capacity market. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, well, so that 20-year contract really is the backbone to the economics of the deal. Now, that's not the full revenue curve for the project. So there is a merchant revenue curve associated with storage projects, but those services ultimately that we provide to the government are contracted services, and as I said, that provides the bankability of the project to get financing. The merchant revenue curve, though, is very volatile, and there are many opinions on what that looks like into the future. And so it was really important for us to structure this deal so that the project economics really hinged on that contract for services with the
Ah.
ISO. And if you will, look at the merchant revenue curve as the icing on the cake. And we were able to work through that, the economics with our partner now with Enerstore and Aecon as the significant equity investors in the project, and get comfortable around that mechanism and how we can provide certainty to cover off our debt service requirements.
I used to go to a little coffee shop in White Rock, BC, back in the day, and the owner used to tell me, he said, "My regulars pay the bills, that make sure that I break even and have a little profit, and the walk-ins are determine how much profit I make." And it sounds like that principle underlines your project. The contract with the system operator pays the bills, allows you to get financing. You make some money, but the then selling other services on a merchant basis into the market, that's really where you make your profit.
That's exactly right. It's not an overly lucrative deal. I mean, I think that there's an element of risk sharing here, and ultimately the goal was to provide a solution that benefited the ratepayers, of which our community members are ratepayers in the province of Ontario. And so there was a multiple bottom line approach to this thing. And, in addition to that, there are also very positive environmental attributes to the storage facility in terms of its greenhouse gas reductions. And you know what? The capabilities of energy storage solution here in the market, provide instantaneous solutions to the energy market where none existed in the past. And I think that gives the IESO, the market operator, a lot more flexibility in how they run their assets and how they optimize the performance of the grid.
Well, before we get into a discussion of exactly the services that your battery project provides, we have to talk about the fact that you came in ahead of schedule and under budget, because these days that's almost unheard of. Your budget was 800 million, you came in at 700 million and ahead of schedule. How'd you do that?
Well, listen, I think it's a testament to good planning, good partnerships, and we've always prided ourselves on, positioning ourselves as a solutions provider in the market. So the incubation idea of the United Storage Project really was born in our boardroom in partnership with Enerstore. But by bringing in the likes of the Enerstore and the Acons of the world, we were able to build a winning team, if you will, to execute this thing as you said, on time and on budget. And, you know, we're tremendously proud that this project actually was built through a partnership that we have with AECON, the A6N General Partnership, where we had over 40 of our community members actually in the field building this facility. The lasting value associated with that is not only pride of our membership actually constructing this thing, but also the skills development that we've had now through the A6N General Partnership, which has enabled that partnership to go on and start constructing other projects in and around the region.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for a moment because I spent a good chunk of the 90s working with Saskatchewan First Nations. And one of the consistent principles on which they operated was always to build capacity within the community. So doing a project is not just about making money or creating jobs, it's learning how to do things, learning how to manage businesses, acquiring technical skills, acquiring construction skills, all of those things builds capacity. And it sounds like that was a big thing for this project.
Well, that's exactly right. Like, listen, so there's lots of aspirations in the marketplace. There's a big push, as you know, Markham, for Indigenous procurement. The unfortunate thing is there's not a lot of, you know, capacity in the market to actually perform these services. And so a key strategy for Six Nations Development Corporation is to go out in the market and look for, you know, blue chip companies who really understand the importance of, you know, truth and reconciliation calls to action, to actually be prepared to get engaged and work with us, to mobilize a workforce, to build the capabilities, but more importantly, to be able to execute a contract on time, on budget. And so it's through the creativity of our partnership with AECON that we've been able to deploy our workforce, build that capacity, but also execute that contract on time and on budget.
Well, let's talk about the services that the battery project provides to the grid. So we've already talked about the contract, so the offtake contract, which means that you charge when it's cheap and you discharge at the best when you can make the best profit. But you've also got energy arbitrage, ancillary services, and congestion relief. Could you explain those, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, this is a really a new tool to the market, right? And it does really serve to shave off the peaks of energy demand in the province of Ontario. And I think that its most important attribute is the flexibility to provide those services on an on demand need, right? And so I think that there are, you know, I'm not certainly not an expert in, you know, in quantifying all of the attributes and how this benefits the grid, other than I know that you know, there it provides a solution that doesn't exist in the marketplace. And so you know, the operating reserve, for example, is something that, you know, provides a certain degree of comfort in the province of Ontario that they can rely on when they need it. And you know, the arbitrage game really is, you know, shifting the power when the time is needed, right? And so you know, the energy arbitrage game really kind of goes hand in glove with that merchant revenue curve. You know, you buy low, you sell high, and you optimize, you know, your bid-in pricing at optimal periods when the energy requirements are at its highest and best value to the project. But at the same time, that mitigates the need for the province of Ontario to ramp up, let's just say a natural gas plant to provide for, you know, a window of time power solution that may not be 2 or 3 hours, but they may have to run a gas plant for 2 or 3 hours just to provide a small increment of power. And so I think that, you know, the instantaneous nature of this product mitigates the need to run those gas plants, which in of itself triggers a greenhouse gas reduction and benefits the environment. And so those are the key attributes for us that I think you know, really checked a lot of boxes, because it's not just an investment in making money. It's an investment that provides value to the ratepayer and mitigates that greenhouse gases.
Now, we've seen grids that have a high percentage of intermittent generation, primarily from wind and solar. And we saw Spain go down. Now, it turned out that the intermittent power wasn't the primary cause it wasn't the primary issue. But, you know, California has had issues. And ancillary services that are really technical, and 99.9% of my audience isn't going to be that interested, but is absolutely fundamentally critical to grid modernization, are things like frequency regulation and operating reserve and ramping support, all of those things that grid managers, you know, lay awake at night worrying about. And batteries provide a great way to help with that. And so I assume that those kinds of conversations took place with the system operator.
Oh yeah, for sure. And as again, I'm not the expert, but one of the things that we have done, as I said earlier, is we partner with Enerstore in particular. They have, that this is what they do. This is where their area of expertise is, and they were able to carry the football in ways that we couldn't in terms of the technical aspects and the value proposition of the United project to the IESO. And you know what? I do know that it is a product now that serves the market, and we are seeing early performance metrics that it's doing exactly what we expected it would do, and in fact, it's performing better than we expected in many of those cases. So it's now become a tool that the province of Ontario can lean on through the ISO. And we're also seeing, as you know, more calls for more storage. We see more calls for 8-hour duration storage. So as we expand through the LT2 procurement, we're going to see more of these assets in play in the strategic areas in the province, which is just going to be more tools in the toolkit for the IESO to use and manage the grid and the grid demand in an optimal way. I think ultimately in the best interest of the ratepayer.
Well, let's talk about this is a 4-hour battery. This provides 4 hours of service. Um, how do you create an 8-hour service? Is it a different chemistry? Is it just more of the same batteries? How does that work?
Right now, it's just double the batteries. It's just double the batteries is the technology. So listen, there's lots of emerging technology out there on what's possible in the future, but from a contracting standpoint or a bankability standpoint, the fastest path forward on an 8-hour duration is just to double the battery size
Uh,
and to utilize the same methodologies. Of course, capital costs are higher with higher duration, but nonetheless, you get that greater duration of service, right? Which ultimately I think gives more flexibility to the ISO as they go around system planning.
Sure, and that increases the value of the whatever electrons you're providing, and so that covers that's the economics of it. One of the things I find fascinating is that your project essentially takes the installed battery power in Ontario, which you have 15, 16 million people in the province, from 225 megawatts to 475 megawatts. Now, we just had a big debate in Alberta, at least in Energy Media we did, because they have 30% already intermittent power generation, and they only just brought up their storage to 400 megawatts. And compared to places like California, which got 37 million people and 10,000 megawatts of battery storage, these seem like relatively much smaller percentages for the grid. So, what are the plans to go from 475 to quite a lot of battery storage, or are we talking about very slow incremental growth?
Well, there certainly is more. There has been more calls for power for more calls for energy storage projects. In fact, right after the United project was contracted, we participated in the expedited RFP, expedited LT1, secured a 300 megawatt battery project with Boralex. And then in the LT1 round, we secured three more battery projects in storage projects in LT1. We're ramping up for LT2 bid submission. So right now, Six Nations alone has 1,100 megawatts of contracted storage. So that's 4,400 megawatt hours of storage in and of itself. And we're not the only player in the market. We happen to be, I think, the largest private investor in energy storage in the country. We just happen to be Indigenous, and we're quite proud of that. But we see, there certainly is a demand for much more energy storage in the province because, as we've proven out the value proposition for Oneida, the system operator is clearly seeing that we need more of these assets in the market, as I said, in strategic areas to help optimize the grid performance. Yep.
Now, I know there was some federal funding involved in here, but I'm wondering if we're seeing the same phenomenon that here in Canada we're seeing in the United States, where a little bit of government money leverages or crowds in a lot of private capital. Is that what happened here?
Well, so in the case of Oneida, we were very fortunate to have a $50 million grant from Enercan, which is a key enabler or early enabler of the project. We also had the Canada Infrastructure Bank who stepped up to provide, subordinate senior debt at a time when the bankability of these assets, if you think back to the volatility in the market at the time, CIB played a critical role in actually, creating the opportunity for this thing to get contracted. Now, as we move forward into the more competitive environments, the CIB doesn't play an active role in competitive procurements because their job is not to crowd out, financial institutions. But we also see the inclusion now of the ITCs, investment tax credits, against these assets, which I think are materially a part of enhancing the economics and ultimately lowering the cost to ratepayers of this service. So these federal programs, these commitments are critically important to enabling this infrastructure, which I think is important across the spectrum of all infrastructure. We need federal aid to help, support these types of innovative solutions. Now, I must say, Markham, the United Project, I think, is a classic example of what's possible. And if you think of it from a whole value stack of participation, you've got, as I mentioned, the federal government through Enercan, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So you got the federal government, you got the IESO as the offtake user through their contract for services. Then you've got, public companies like Northland Power and Aecon actively investing. You've got private companies like Interstore in Toronto. You've got Indigenous community like Six Nations, and you have a willing host community here in Haldeman County. It's checking all the boxes, and you need to have that kind of alignment to do these innovative things moving forward. And so I think it's an example of what's possible with that Indigenous inclusion.
Over the last 3 years, we've done a lot of interviews here at Energy Media about industrial strategy and policy. And what you describe, where you bring all of the stakeholders together, everybody's got a role to play. It's not that the government is necessarily leading, but the government helps. All the stakeholders agree we're going to do this battery project, and we're all going to do play our part in this project. And you get it up and running. You learn. The banks become familiar. Your partners become familiar. Everybody gets expertise, and then the government's role in funding or leading can be can I don't know, fade out over time, or it's not as needed for the second project, the third project, the fourth project, because now you've got that expertise and capacity and all of that. And this just sounds like a perfect model for places like Alberta or even British Columbia, where large First Nation communities, and they really want to get into this. So, are you being contacted by First Nations communities in other provinces who say, "We like this. Can you help us? Maybe do something in our community?"
Yeah, I must say that what, in my view, I think that the key catalyst to the United Project's success is the fact that it was Indigenous led. It was 50% led by the Six Nations Development Corporation in the early stages with Enerstore out of Toronto. And it was through that leadership that we were able to crowd in that federal support through NRCan and the CIB. And it certainly got the attention of the province of Ontario. So I think that our involvement in the early conceptual development of the project and its formative stages brought those stakeholders together and caused them to open their eyes to the reality that something like this is in fact possible. And so yes, I think this has positioned us very well in the market. Certainly as a leader, an Indigenous leader of energy storage across this country. I do get contacted a lot from other nations to see if we can go there and help them. We certainly share what we can share, but we have a full plate of opportunity here on our doorstep, Markham, and it's hard for me to pull myself away. But we certainly do engage and share as much as possible. And if there are investment opportunities in other treaty areas or traditional territories of other nations, we have explored partnership opportunities where we will work beside our brothers and sisters across the country to help enable them to do something similar, but we won't do it at their expense. In other words, we won't engage in a project that would isolate them. So the key criteria would be such that we would have to be invited in by that nation.
Sure, understood. I want to close off the interview this way, Matt. And again, getting back to the reporting we've done on power grids over the last 5 years, it's very clear that the old style power grids are being modernized and being upgraded, and their intermittent power like wind and solar will play a very large role going forward. You know, to greater degree in some provinces and lesser degree in others. Nevertheless, the grid is changing. And I'm wondering if that's a topic of conversation when you're sitting around the table with the system operator, let's say, and they say, look, we know that in 2035 or 2050, the grid is going to need to be more flexible, more resilient, lots of demand side services, and so on. And we see batteries fitting into that in a big way, battery storage. And are those kind of conversations taking place?
Yeah, I think that they are. I think that, we're right now, if we're going to get serious, first of all, about net zero, we need to get serious about investment. We need to get serious about collaboration. We know that, there's over $1 trillion of investment that needs to be made in this country in order to enable, a net zero future. We know that, the bulk of that development is going to happen on land where there's an Indigenous treaty interest or treaty assertion or land claim. And the conversation needs to start now with those communities. And so, the province of Ontario, and to their credit, they get it. They actually realize that, Six Nations or other First Nations in the province are key enablers to this development and actually can help expedite this development path. We need to do things together. And you know what? I think the Oneida project is an example of us actually taking the lead to demonstrate that it is possible to work with Indigenous communities to provide an outcome that creates multiple, value streams, not just for our community in terms of the economic benefit, but also for the ratepayer, as I said, and the environmental attributes. And so I think, we're seeing a lot of receptivity here in our dialogue with the province of Ontario. They're listening. They're looking to do things innovative and creative with us. And I think that's a signal to, the government's embracement of TRC and other obligations with respect to our treaty interests and rights.
Matt, this is fascinating, and I really look forward to further interviews with you in the future about the projects you're just working on now as you bring them to fruition. So, thank you very much for this.
Markham, it's always a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.